Well, John, welcome to your final podcast with the IPA.
Hello, Dan. Thank you for dressing up.
Yes, I've dressed up for you, just for you.
It had nothing to do with the board meeting today.
No, I keep my tie on, John, for that, unlike some people. So it's my fight against casualisation.
Well, I had 20 years of board meetings.
Yes, you did, but it's coming to an end.
It is.
And this is the last, as we talked about last time, the last hurrah for the podcast. So,
Well, no, not for the mainstream, because you are going to continue without me.
the mainstream will continue.
How does that make me feel?
Well, you can text in, you can call in. We'll have a caller, John, from,
Mate, I am going to be on the comments section of YouTube.
I don't read them. I
Don't admit that.
get someone else to curate the positive ones.
I still get hassled about
Pretty short list.
about the comments following my so-called interrogation of Tony Abbott after the federal election loss last year.
Yeah, they were begging for me to come back, and I don't blame them. So what I thought I could do,
You're here now.
what I thought we could do is talk about what you've learned, your observations of the political system, what's happened, where we're going, and all of the experience that you've had in that context. So
That would be good.
that would be great. So why don't we kick off with where you started with the IPA? Let's say 20 years ago. What was Australia like 20 years ago? How was it different then in terms of debates, in terms of political leaders, in terms of the centre-right? What were your observations?
So a bit of background. I started as executive director of the Institute of Public Affairs, founded, of course, in 1943. In 2005, that was after a background working in politics, federal level, state level, working in the law, working at a university, working at a mining company. So a range of experiences, but of course nothing prepares you for the work in a think tank, the work of dealing with our wonderful members around the country and trying to influence the public debate, educate the public, engage with young people. And I think in 2005, we had no idea the world would be so dramatically different. At 2005, at the federal level, John Howard was in government, and there was an assumption that Australia would always be governed by reasonable political parties. Where if we didn't have a Howard, we might have a Costello, we might have a Hawke. At the very worst, we could be a Keating or a Beazley. Australia was rich, was perceived to have been rich. We'd come out of the recession we had to have in the 1990s. There was certainly a sense of optimism that existed 20 years ago. Culturally, we were a secure country. The debates that we are going through now were a long way off the agenda. Yes, there was a concern about left-wing ideology in universities, but identity politics wasn't a thing. Woke wasn't a thing. DEI were just three letters. When I started in 2005, I had literally never heard of Section 18C. Of the Racial Discrimination Act, and I had no idea that it would come to be such a big part of what we do at the IPA, fighting for freedom of speech. All of the certainties were guaranteed to some extent, and I think that was reflected in where the IPA was. The IPA had a successful history. Today we have 10,000 members, and I think one of the biggest changes over the last 20 years to the IPA is our reflection of mainstream Australians, because back in the day, 20 years ago, the connection between business, between civil society, between the political parties, Labor or left, and mainstream Australians was very strong. That broke down, and it's one of the reasons we are in the situation that we are at the moment.
Did you see the rise of populism coming? Because this has been something that's been, you could say over the last 10 years, really. I mean, this sort of started basically with Trump, with Brexit, with what's happened in continental Europe. Populism means different things to different people, but basically it's because a large and growing minority of the population don't think that their values or their views are reflected by the major political parties. They don't think the system works for them, so they want to have change. Did you ever see anything like this?
No.
On that?
No, I think there's a few things. One is the fact that people even have to give a description to democracy and call it populism and denigrate it just betrays how far removed the elites are from mainstream public opinion. And I think we hadn't assumed that the political parties would become so removed from the public that the public would completely lose trust in the political parties because of that removal and that change in commitment to serving the mainstream and fighting for average Australians. You have the rise of elite knowledge. You have what some have described as an inevitable process of science, technology giving rise to a clerisy, the term is, that attempts to increasingly control how we live. So populism, I see, is and we'll come to this, or is a reaction to the failures of our political parties, to the failures of the promises, cultural and political, that had been made by the political parties, and it's simply a yearning to be heard.
Well, what I find really interesting is the extent to which many of the elite circles have sought, rather than to adjust and to deal with the challenges, to shut it down and ignore it through censorship, through misinformation, disinformation, through e-safety, which is originally notionally designed or purportedly designed to protect children, then it morphs into a much bigger censorship undertaking. And I think you're quite right to say about the term populism, which is used by a lot in the elites to say,
what's the alternative to populism? All right, okay, so one policy is populist. So what's the other policy? Elitist? Is it for the rich? Is it for the experts? What's the alternative?
Well, I think what
do they say?
What they would say basically is that it's just doing things because it's popular. Would be the description.
The mob, okay.
So you're just doing whatever they want.
Yeah, it's an attack on the mob.
Yeah. But the thing is, the reason why a lot of the elites don't like what they call populism is because it's ideas that they have not come up with. That they've missed all of this stuff, right? They're still missing it. Every single day, if you read the mainstream media, they consistently miss what is happening. They're consistently surprised. They were surprised by Trump. They were surprised by Brexit. They're surprised by One Nation, and I'm not saying these things are unalloyed goods, but these are symptoms of a discontented population, and they consistently miss what's happening.
I think they half miss what's happening, and they half won't admit it. They're half afraid of it. They know that many of the policies they pursue are negative for the country. They are negative for the population, but they will double down anyway. And for me, one of the things I find interesting is how, we've, from the centre right, we've talked about the rise of populism, and I think it's completely explicable. But I was struck by a piece in the Melbourne Age and the Sydney Morning Herald this week from Sean Carney. And Sean Carney is a long-standing journalist and opinion writer. He's broadly of the centre-left, but I think he's a very thoughtful writer, and he talks about, he's trying to explain Pauline Hanson, as so many of the left has done, and also in the context of the rapidly declining vote of the two major parties. And he says, and I'm a quote, "For 30 years, the established parties have let too many people down on affordable housing, appropriate, inexpensive, satisfactory education, secure employment, and the ability to bargain for better incomes, quality of life and access to services, and generally the maintenance of a sense of hope and the ability to feel comfortable within society," which of course is the centre-right critique of the situation at the moment. It's significant that when he's talking about all the reasons why people are voting for Pauline Hanson, not even him, Sean Carney, as a thoughtful writer, can talk about energy, climate change, or cultural
immigration.
Cultural dispute.
I haven't read that. Does he use the word immigration at all?
No.
If you can't say that, then you're missing the whole. I mean, that's.
But for me, it's
that's one of the top.
Well, it's absolutely,
by far,
and it's a key issue to Australians. Yep. But for me, it's interesting how the right and the left are coming together. And as we've spoken about, when I talked about the potential end of Liberal Party, at least as we know it, the end of the federal election last year, I was criticised as being unduly negative and pessimistic. But I think
I can't imagine.
I think one year on, I think if anything, the Liberal Party continues to fall, and if anything, 1 year on its existence is even less certain than it was 12 months ago.
Well, what does that mean then for the country? Is it going to be like what I have said a couple of times is one scenario is that we basically become more like continental Europe, where we have 4 or 5 parties with 15 to 30% of the vote, and then you have different coalitions that form out of that. I think that's probably the most likely scenario in the near term, but our voting system of compulsory preferential voting means that you can still have like Labor having a pretty small primary vote, but a lot of seats. And admittedly, you can get that in first past the post. That's what happened in the UK with Labor over there, who didn't do very well with the popular vote, but had a whole ton of seats. So it can happen in any system, I guess. But I think that's where it's going. Do you reckon that that's
at the minute, yes. And for someone like me, I think that is a positive scenario. I think that is good. I think we need more voices in the debate. We need more voices in Parliament. I'm not one of these people who says the centre-right has to unite under one banner, because how's that gone for the last 20 years? And as people say to me, well, why have you given up, John, on the Liberal Party? And I haven't quite completely, but when I say the important things to me, like freedom of speech, every party on the centre-right but the Liberal Party has fought for freedom of speech, and we'll come to that in the 20-year history of the fight for freedom of speech in Australia. But One Nation has consistently supported freedom of speech. The Libertarians have consistently supported freedom of speech. I look forward to recounting over 10 minutes every single Liberal failure on freedom of speech, and not just failures, not just sins of omission, sins of commission. So I think the fragmentation, the fracturing of the centre-right in Australia, I think is potentially very exciting.
But doesn't that mean that Labor will then be government for ages? Just like with, the post-World War II era, you had Labor became fragmented with the DLP. We're seeing that now, aren't we? Isn't that
no? I don't think that necessarily follows at all. You can see a Liberal Party or some successor to the Liberal Party with 20-25% of the vote, One Nation or some form of One Nation party with 20% of the vote. You have got centre-right leaning independents. The idea that history is preordained like that, I don't think applies.
One of the big shifts over the last 20 years, I think, has been the focus on culture. When I started at the IPA some 10 or 11 years ago, there wasn't a lot of culture stuff. We had, you had the Foundations of Western Civilization program, which is a big deal and unique in Australia. It hadn't been done, still hasn't been done. But in terms of talking about the flag, talking about Australia Day, talking about the anthem, talking about the persistent attacks on our way of life, that just wasn't really on the radar nearly as much.
But it didn't need to be.
You have freedom of speech, which is a cultural issue, but I think of it as a little bit different. But that is now a huge part of what, not only what we do, but the whole centre-right movement is energised by cultural and social issues in a way that it wasn't a decade ago. Why do you reckon that's happened? It just, we started getting attacked and we realised we have to do something about it. Why did it take that time for us to realise this, do you reckon?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that the centre-right, or conservatives, however defined, those who believe in the future of Australia as a good country, took the assumptions about Australia as a good country for granted. And at the very first criticisms, the very first assaults on the notion of what it is to be Australian and Australia as a good country, conservatives and patriotic Australians sat back because I think they thought it couldn't be sustained. Australia is, by any definition, one of the best countries in the world. As Tony Abbott says, if you're Australian, you've won the lottery of life. And people couldn't understand the sorts of critiques that were being made. Some of them were based on false information or simply completely ahistorical analysis. But the more that those who believed in Australia sat back, the more that they assumed that common sense would return, the left kept on pushing against an open door. So you have a phenomenon, then you have a deeper phenomenon. You can argue that liberalism is expressed as a political ideology has that institutional critique built into it, so that liberal societies are always critiquing themselves and criticising themselves, which at one level is a strength, but it can lead to an annihilation. Ultimately, I think not enough people thought about the fact that you don't always need to tolerate intolerance. And then you had a bunch of other phenomena, and I brought in a couple of books that we'll mention.
You want to do your favourite segment already?
Well, I mean,
we'll get it.
I don't know whether actually I've previously mentioned these, but if I was to think about books that have influenced me over the last 20 years at the IPA, and I was thinking about what a couple that I'd pull out. The first one that I'd pull out, going to this exact point about our cultural decay, was a book by an American historian, Christopher Lasch, The Revolt of the Elites and Betrayal of Democracy, that came out, I think, in 94 or 95. And in addition to all the things I've just described, he talks about something that 30 years on has absolutely come to apply. And this is just the description from the jacket. Lasch says that democracy today is not threatened by the masses, but by the elites. These elites, mobile and increasingly global in outlook, refuse to accept limits or ties to nation and place. Lasch contends that as they isolate themselves in their networks and enclaves, they abandon the middle class, divide the nation, and betray the idea of democracy. And we saw elites removing themselves from the mainstream. We saw business elites particularly critiquing and criticising concepts of Australia. For me, people talk about it as a little thing, but it was hugely symbolic, and we've talked about this. The Woolworths ban on Australia Day. That is...
the Woolworths ban. Yeah.
Ban and selling Australia Day merchandise. If you want to describe how the elites have attacked democracy and the impact of our institutional structures on our community, then that typifies everything. You can talk about the big business supporting proposals for Australia to be racially divided. You can talk about big business giving not recognising Australia Day. But what Woolworths did as a huge supermarket chain, such an important part of the fabric of Australian communities, to say we're not going to support Australia Day, sums up everything. And something like that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, could never have been contemplated. The other thing that's happened is this change has happened very quickly. It's happened in the span of a generation.
But isn't it one of those things that slowly then quickly?
Exactly.
It's built up over many, many, many years.
Exactly.
I think it's people go through the education system, they all hang out together, then they work their way up to, senior positions in the corporate world, in government, in not-for-profit, in education, and then it seems like it's all just happened overnight, but it's been building for a long time. Then we're like, oh wow, what's just happened to our country?
Yeah.
To me, it does feel like it's happened quick, but I think it's been building for a long time, and it gets to that issue that I think that a lot of people on the centre-right became complacent about what was happening to institutions. And your observation about neutrality is a really important one, because the right has typically taken the view that we have to have neutrality.
We believe in 50-50. Yeah.
But we can't think that anymore, right? Because our opponents don't think that way. And that's why we are now... I think the last few years have been pushing the limits of liberalism, which is how much are we going to tolerate, how much are we going to defend open spaces towards those who are hostile to us. A great example is, people going on protests and marches, which I defend, very broadly, people's right to do that, because I just think that's something that you get to do in a free country like Australia's. But there does come a point at where you're like, you've got to stop doing this. Like every single week going on protests about Palestine or the Invasion Day protests. And to me, it's just to the point where, where do you say enough's enough that you're not allowed to do this? So it has forced us on the centre right to ask ourselves, well, what are the limits of liberalism? To what extent do we need to be willing to use governmental power to assert certain values that you must not transgress in this country? And as we talked about in an earlier one,
together, so that Australians of differing views, we can all get along.
Yeah. And as we talked about in an earlier discussion about the flag, 10 years ago, I would not have supported criminalising the burning of the Australian flag. But now,
do I still don't?
You're still a bit woke on that.
I'm still a bit freedom.
But it is an example, right, where people,
But I could almost...
But I'm fed up with it.
But I could... What frightens me and the tragedy of what's happened is I could almost contemplate it.
Yeah, because there comes a point where you have to draw a line.
Everybody's mind is a bit... It as a symbol. Well, I still think the flag is a symbol of success, democracy and unity. I could almost now... I can't quite, but I could...
But you probably wouldn't go... You wouldn't die in a ditch over... You probably wouldn't...
No,
die in a ditch, would you, over it?
Probably not.
You might oppose it.
But I mean, and this is how... well, I'll say what I was going to comment on. This is how extremism drives extremism. So conservatives, classical liberals would, let's take an easy example, support Australia's university being divided 50% between conservative academics, 50% between left-wing academics. That's how we think a society should work, and that will create debate. The left do not think that.
No.
The left will not be happy until our cultural institutions are 100% left and there are no conservative voices anywhere, and that's what we are starting to see. So for people like us who believe in diversity, who believe in live and let live, who believe in a debate, it then becomes very difficult to manage these discussions. And so the impact that we see is the cultural barrenness of the country at the moment, as every divergent voice from the current cultural narrative is driven out of the public space. So then do we have government action, state action to put back those voices, or is there some alternative to what we've got?
Yeah, and that's basically where we are in the debate. Yeah. Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe and you won't miss any of the action. While you're at it, head to ipa.org.au, follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website, so that way you will find all of our research and analysis. Now back to the chat. The other thing is that for a lot of people on the left, it's all politics all the time. So they don't accept that there's a difference between life and politics. Like their life is about politics. And that's why, they infest everything, like the sport, music, arts, everything is a political statement.
And that's Marx. And that's one of the essences of Marx and Marxism, which is that everything is political.
But that mentality is incompatible with an open free society.
Yeah. So
that's why I draw the line. Is like my view is you're not allowed to behave that way because it ruins it for everybody else. So they're ruining. You can't go to if you're interested in theatre, there's always someone making a political statement. You can't go to the footy without it. And I just think that should not be allowed because it ruins these neutral places where people from different sections of society can come together and enjoy something when you wouldn't ordinarily do so.
Where the left and the right can come together. So we've talked about the beginning of the AFL footy season, and on one of the footy shows that I'm addicted to on Monday and Tuesday night, now that the Western Bulldogs are doing really well and I can, follow them again. There was a discussion about why the AFL crowds have been down. So a little example, this is admittedly a Victorian, South Australian, perhaps a bit of Queensland, a bit of New South Wales example.
But it probably applies to other.
And it applies perhaps to other cultural activities and sporting activities. And one of the news organisations did a survey as to why people weren't going to the footy. So cost of living was first, rule changes was second, cultural woke was third. And one of the commentators said, and I won't embarrass her, she couldn't understand why you wouldn't go to the football because it's too woke. I will not go to the football because I want to enjoy the footy.
Yeah.
I do not want to be preached at, whether it's something that I agree with or not. I do not like my activities being the entire public domain being used for ideological purposes. And someone like her can't understand why anyone would object.
And just to get political for a moment,
No, never. We're political on the Mainstream podcast.
this is what Angus Taylor needs to talk about. This is like, people will say, oh, why are you talking about the footy? This stuff really matters to people and their lives. And we have not had any, I can't think of any political leaders that talk about these cultural issues. And it was one of the, if you
No, hang on. Let's correct that. Pauline Hanson does.
not a lot.
Well, no, I'll say,
Welcome to the country. Yes,
welcome to the country, the flag. Jacinda Price does.
Yeah.
There are some who do. Alexander does.
That's true.
But by and large, most don't.
Okay, that's a fair point. But it needs to be a part of a coordinated approach to actually saying, like, what do we believe?
Yeah, hang on.
We believe that sport is for all Australians and that politics should not be in sport. And if the AFL or the NRL continues with its woke political agenda, they do not receive 1 cent of taxpayer funds. Watch how quickly they change their attitude.
Yeah, I'll go further. I was contemplating while you were talking.
So you're not listening to what I was saying. Is that what you...
I was trying to do both. But let us not think that all politicians don't understand culture. Labor politicians understand culture completely.
Oh.
No. They understand what the voice does. They understand what the ceremonies at sport do. They understand climate change being embedded in everything. The problem for the centre-right in Australia, and certainly not perhaps in the United States, is that because they rested on their laurels for so long, they have no language to engage in this debate. They're not interested. They're incapable of arguing it, which is why they rest on economics, and then they ponder why we are sitting on 18% in the polls.
Yeah. But you don't seem as fired up about the footy as I am.
I'm very fired. I started this.
Yeah, okay.
I started a topic.
All right, that's good. That's good. But I just think it's not just about the footy. It's like any cultural institution. I mean, but yeah, that's what I was going to say. With that lady who couldn't understand why people don't like it. It's another example of those who are running the institutions, whether it's the supermarkets, whether it's government, whether it's footy codes, whatever it is. They are so far removed from the community, so removed. And I love it that rule changes are the second, because I just don't watch it because it's not footy anymore. Yeah. I'm not going to go on a rant about it, but if you do surveys of people, they always oppose any change that the AFL wants, and the AFL doesn't care and they do it. So, that's why people don't go.
Yeah, and
I don't want to pay $7.
We can apply lessons to the AFL to Australia's political parties, but what we are going to see into the future is something very different from what we see now. The other point that Sean Carney made in this piece when he was trying to explain the rise not just of One Nation but the decline of the parties is that someone like Pauline Hanson also speaks to the failures of our economic system to provide for anyone other than those who've gone to university. This economic divide that the left was once so obsessed about has now been completely eluded as the Labor Party represents the well-off and the elites.
So what does that say then about, well, just build on, what does that say about the Labor Party?
Well,
why has it, well, I always find this really fascinating because why is it that the Labor Party went down that path, do you reckon? Like, because they became woke, climate, all of this stuff, like real niche issues, anti-Australian.
And abandoned workers.
But back in, Labor was never really that. You could criticise Labor for a lot of other things, but it was never really. In fact, if you look at Paul Keating's, for example, maiden speech, go read. he wasn't woke.
Yeah.
For all of his shortcomings, he wasn't woke. So why? Do you have any thoughts on why that shift happened? I mean, I think a part of it is actually the super funds, to be honest. I mean, the super funds kind of run Labor now in a way that the unions used to, which sort of explains the financial component. But do you have any thoughts?
I think there's that. But I also think it's that the elites are increasingly employed by the government or engaged by the government in some way, and that connection between the state, the Labor Party, and the elites becomes very powerful. And as the share of, however defined, the working class declines, you're going to have, to some extent, an inevitable shift in the direction of the parties in exactly the same way as the traditional left-wing Labor working parties of the United States and Britain have moved in the same way as they have in Australia. And we tended to think, as we've again spoken about, that Australia's separate, we're different, we're special. We're not going to have a Trump, we're not going to have a Farage. Well, we are. We are, and we're experiencing it now. But we were talking about someone like Matt Canavan responding to this. When did you say this? A couple of days ago.
A couple of days ago at the National Press Club. I do not spend my days watching speeches because they're so boring. And it's just all these journalists patting each other on the back. I mean, seriously, it's so boring. But every now and again, you get a Jacinta Price who gave an amazing speech during The Voice, and Matt Canavan. So I think Matt Canavan's speech at the National Press Club, I think, is probably the most important speech given by the leader of a political party in the last decade. And I don't say that lightly. It's like, I wouldn't bother just talking about a speech because politicians speak all the time. But this is actually worth reflecting on because Canavan has actually outlined something different finally. Like someone in Canberra is finally thinking about the big issues, talking about them and offering an alternative for our future. And I just want to read out a couple of things in his speech that I thought were really interesting. He talked about he's outlining a patriot agenda for our national economic revival. He's proposing, he said, we want not just small changes, but we need a revolution to our economic system. Some of it will need the slaying of long overdue sacred cows, including a naive belief that open trade and open borders and open flows of people are always and everywhere going to be the best thing for our country. As Canavan says, these things have been important and helped generate wealth, but they were a specific set of solutions to a specific set of problems that we faced in the 70s and 80s of the sclerotic economy that we had. And he talked about, basically, as I interpreted it, the limits of liberalism or neoliberalism, and that we need to think about a different economic future. And this was the first time I've heard a political leader actually talk about, this issue in this way.
And is it too late?
No, it's not too late. It's not too late. It will be soon if we don't get our skates on, but it's all very fixable. I mean, half of the problems we have are just from bad government policy, right? If you get rid of policies like net zero, if you get rid of the over-regulation and so forth, a lot of this is fixed. The problem is there's the political system that can't get this through it, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think our bad political decisions and bad policies reflect a deeper malaise. So at the same time, while I'm saying elites are going to push through policies that hurt mainstream Australians, I'm also going to acknowledge that by and large, until relatively recently, Australians were happy with climate change policy. They were happy with red tape. They were happy for the nanny state. One of the things that disappointed me the most, and I used disappointed advisedly, and I felt much more strongly about this at the time, and I still do, is Australians' attitude to being locked down, locked up for months. We welcomed it. So I think it's a lot more, these policies reflect an Australia. I mean, people talk about, Australia, I don't recognise it anymore. Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't recognise an Australia that I thought was once welcoming of risk-taking, that had a larrikin attitude. And, there's a debate as to whether Australia ever was the libertarian paradise that it's made out to be. But we allow our politicians to get away with this, and I think it's more than bad policy, because if we were rebelling against bad policy, then Anthony Albanese would have been tossed out. He wouldn't have been re-elected with a massive majority.
Yeah, but his vote meant backwards. I mean, the vote for Albanese, I think I might have said it before, wasn't really an endorsement of. I don't interpret it as an endorsement of Labor policies. I think it was a rejection and a fear of what a Dutton-led coalition was purported to going to do in government. That's
But
what I think
doesn't
drove
but
most of it. It
does
wasn't a
public
great.
policy reflect ultimately the public in some form?
No, because not at the moment. Because
Well, it doesn't at the moment.
no,
Yeah.
because we have a broken political system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're right to say that basically you get the leaders you deserve. I think that's true over the long term. And
Well, Australia hasn't been very deserving.
no. Well, I think the
What have we
quality.
done to ourselves?
Well, it's only been. I mean, Abbott, and then since Abbott hasn't been great. It's okay. It's only been. It's recoverable, but as you say, the system's broken. So I don't necessarily say because our leaders are terrible, because policy is terrible, that means that Australians are okay with it. I don't, by and large. I see where you're coming from, but what can you do to fix it?
So what impact do you think Canavan's speech will have?
Well, I thought we'll find out at the Farrer by-election.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty significant. What is going to be the thing to watch now is, will the Liberal Party
Change.
change?
Can the Liberal Party
Because
change? So what do we even change?
The Nats can change, but the Nats are really under the pump from One Nation. Like if an election were held today, the Nats would probably lose a lot.
Yeah.
You really need the leader of the Liberal Party to be saying, in my view, saying this stuff. And I don't know if they're close to being able to do that. And again, this is not a reflection of the individuals involved. It's just you still have a deeply divided, fractured party. I mean, I reckon half of the Liberals would have listened to this and loved it, and half of them would have hated it.
Did Canavan talk about culture?
Not really. But I think we've won a lot of the culture debates, is how I feel, in the public. We haven't won them in the political arena, but I think on the flag, on Welcome to Country, on Australia Day, we've won those debates with the public. I don't.
But if it's not, which is
The public
great,
doesn't
and,
need-
that's been and the IPA has been part of that leadership to bring about that change. But if it's ultimately not reflected in politics and in how we live, then to what end is it? Until the Australian curriculum is rewritten to celebrate our success as a democracy, winning the debate in the public doesn't matter.
Well, I think it matters a bit.
Well,
It's better than losing. It's better than losing.
The first part of and until the AFL says no more rule changes, no more acknowledgement of country, no more politics, then nothing counts.
The crowds would explode. They'd make more money than ever.
I know.
This is the interesting thing. I wanted to ask you about this, right? So why does if it's all about sort of politics, why is like the AFL or other sporting codes, why are they woke? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like part of it to me is it's transactional with like Labor gives the money, so they do things Labor wants. Clearly the AFL does that. But beyond that, I don't really get it fully. I don't fully understand, other than you can say, well, they come from the same club, they go to the same cocktail parties, so they're all a part of this. So that's a part of it.
Yep, that's a lot. I think that's a large part of it.
But it is increasingly obvious now, particularly since the voice debate, what happened to Brad Banducci at Woolworths, that there are consequences and costs to this, declining AFL crowds. I don't fully understand. Maybe it is just as simple as they're blind, they're out of touch, they don't care, they don't get it, they just do what they want. Is it simple as that? Why is it?
No, I think it's more than that. They do it because they can.
But why do they care? I don't really think that...
Because there are people in position of power who actually want to get the rest, like we do. Well, I would like all of Australia to believe in the things that mainstream Australians believe in. There are people in positions of power who believe they are superior, they have a better moral view of the world, they have an ideological position that is superior to anyone else's, and that they are going to use the vehicles that they have of institutional power through our civic institutions to impose that on mainstream Australians.
You see, I don't agree. I don't think that most of these CEOs believe in any of this stuff. I don't think that the CEO of the AFL could care less about woke. And I think a lot of this woke DEI stuff, they just did it because they thought that's what they're supposed to do. I don't think they believe it at all. I think they're transactional, and I think they just do this because that's how they keep their.
No, I think there is a bureaucratic imperative to it that goes way below the CEO of these organisations.
Yeah.
It goes above the CEO to the board, and it goes below to the managers and general managers.
I reckon most of them in private wouldn't really care about this stuff. They might say, yeah, it's good, but I don't know.
But I think the CEOs, but 2 levels down, they will all believe it.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. You reckon that's driving it?
That's part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair enough. The other thing I wanted to ask, John, is the scale of culture change that we've seen has been massive. So we had the famous Bob Hawke speech in 1988 on the bicentenary of Australia. So that was Labor then. Labor now is we're going to divide everybody by race and have a treaty. So, I mean, that's close to a 40-year period, so it's not overnight, but in the space of a couple of generations, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it, and we talk a lot about the pace of cultural change. For me, again, a snapshot of that pace of cultural change is, as you say, 1988, more than 1 million Australians come together to celebrate Australia's bicentenary. Bob Hawke makes a wonderful speech about no privilege of origin, there's no hierarchy of descent, we're all Australians, and commitment to Australia is all. 4 years later, so just 4 years, 1992, Paul Keating goes and makes his Redfern speech. He talks about Australia being stolen, about Australia being built on dispossession, Australia being built on the ideas that are completely contradictory to those that we accept of democracy, of participation, of equality. And he says that we need to be apologising for our shameful history. That happened in 4 years. It revealed the trend of the intellectual discourse in Australia, and from that so much flows. It's interesting if we're talking about attitudes of the public being reflected in politics and policy. So you look up the Australian National Curriculum and you can Google, you can search the words, you can search the topics. The Redfern speech, Paul Keating telling Australians to apologise for their shameful history, is talked about, and students learn it. Students are forced to learn it. Students are forced to learn Paul Keating telling Australians to be apologetic for their history. There's no mention of Bob Hawke and his discussion about how we are all Australians and how there is no privilege of origin and how we should celebrate our country. For me, and the left understand this cultural change, and again, as we've just been talking about, the centre right has been very slow to come to this. I mean, the national curriculum was basically an idea of the centre right. Under the coalition government, the national curriculum was basically unchanged. And then we talk about why don't Australians, or especially young Australians, feel proud of their country. But increasingly they do, because the Australians are rebelling against this. The other thing, actually, while we're on the topic of the Redfern speech, Keating talks about the insularity of the 1960s. Well, the 1960s passed the 67 referendum. They passed equal voting laws. In Australians in the 1960s welcomed people from everywhere, and there wasn't the rampant anti-Semitism that we now see flowing through our streets in Australia in the 1960s.
Well, that's fascinating about the 4-year change, because it suggests that we won that as well.
Yeah, and it shows you how quickly things can change. You can go from a peak.
Yeah. Because then it was kind of, and this is what kind of drove, well, it's actually kind of what drove One Nation to start with, when you think about it. And then, but Howard, I think one thing that Howard did very well was he was able to basically kibosh a lot of this. He didn't really, I think one of his limitations was he didn't really tackle it head on.
But he also didn't need to tackle it.
But he kind of, he put an end to a lot of that, what he called the black armband view of history.
Which was very powerful.
You have to say pretty successfully, probably for about a generation. he was able to kind of keep a lid on a lot of
Well,
that.
this is
But
interesting.
it wasn't defeated,
He
though.
kept a lid on it politically, but not culturally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As in, like, at the university.
At the university and through our civic institutions. I mean, John Howard had majority in the Senate. He could have repealed Section 18C. He didn't, because Section 18C had not been weaponised at the time and no one knew what it was. It was passed in the last few days of the Keating government. It was passed as a measure that would only apply to a very limited number of people. And then within 10 years, it becomes the lethal weapon that it now exists as.
Well, John, free speech, big topic, a lot to unpack. So I think we'll save that to part 2 of our chat.